Hello everyone. So I thought that it would be best that I give you some instructions to help you in what to do. So this is a lesson that we would normally be having. So it needs to be completed ideally when our lesson would take place, but it certainly needs to be handed in by the end of the day. So the end of the day on Monday. So make sure your sound is turned up so you can listen to the instructions and you can follow the video for what you need to do. So you're going to need to be creating this or answering the questions on a Google Docs document as you normally do for a homework. So you might have seen that I have shared our remote learning work here. And obviously you've gone on to the PowerPoint slide to see it, which I'm on here now. So you need to create a Google Docs document like you normally do. And our title is on this slide here. So Slave Rebellion and Resistance. And you can put your name as well. It doesn't matter too much, but because obviously you will upload it so I can see your name. So this is what we're focusing on today. Slave Rebellion and Resistance. You will have a sort of ways of doing assessment coming up, and it's all going to be focused on the slave trade. So I want to make sure that we don't miss out on any time. So moving on to slave revolts, we've looked at a couple of ways in which the slaves resisted, passive resistance and active resistance. So today we're looking at the ways that they might revolt, particularly on ships. So there were a number of major slave rebellions on ships. About 10% of the slave ships did experience some sort of slave revolt, as you can see here. Usually though, as we've discussed in class, those are normally stopped by the crew because the crew would have guns and the resources to stop this. But there were examples of some successful mutinies on the ships. So if you go to our next slide, then there's the first task that I want you to do. So it's to look at sources, which is obviously very important in history. So historical evidence is sometimes limited in what it tells us about an event. So sometimes we can read a source and we can get a lot of information from it, and then sometimes we can read it and we have questions still about it. So I want you to make a table with two lists for what this source, which is on the next slide, does tell you about this particular slave mutiny. A mutiny is when people on a ship refuse to do as they're told, and what this source doesn't tell you. So I've given an example that it does tell us there were 96 slaves on board, but it doesn't tell us what happened to the slaves after the mutiny. So I would like you to come up with a few more examples of does tell us and doesn't tell us. And then answer the question, overall, how useful is this source? Is this a useful source? The source can be found on the next slide. So you can see here, source B, it's adapted from a letter of a man describing the mutiny, so you can have a read of it there. Any words, obviously, please do look them up on Google or in a dictionary to help yourself. So that's task one. So you would be answering those questions on this document here. So for example, I could type task 1 and I would be creating my table and answering the questions. So moving on, we're looking at a group of people called the Maroons. And there were examples of some very successful communities of runaway slaves that kind of developed their own way of life. One of these most successful ones were a group of people that were known as the Maroons, which lived in Jamaica, which is in the Caribbean. And they had their own way of life, they set up their own towns, and they helped other slaves in escaping as well and helping to join their community. Really the most famous Maroon is this lady here. This is a drawing of her, a woman that we would call, she's known as Nanny. I think that's to symbolize the fact that she's kind of considered as a warm, helpful person. And so she was really the person who helped so many slaves escape from Jamaica and join their community. A lot of them were eventually sent to prison and shipped to places elsewhere. But actually about 2,500 slaves did manage to escape the Jamaican plantations in the 1820s. So there are some examples of some successful groups there. So your next task on slide 8. So Jamaica gained its independence, freedom from British rule in 1962. So following from this, the Jamaican government put an image of Nanny, this woman, on their currency, so on their money notes. So I want you to think about why they did that, because what does she symbolize? What does she mean to the people? What does she represent? So I've put a sentence starter here that you can use. So you can obviously copy this or write it out on your Google document. And moving on. So the Haitian Revolution is really the most famous slave revolution. So revolution means a big change. And this happened in what was a French-owned area, so colony, a French-owned area, which was called Saint-Domingue at the time. It's now known as Haiti. Today it's in the Caribbean. And the man who led the revolt was a man called Toussaint Louverture. He was a former slave who had been granted his freedom by his master. So he had a kinder master than many did. He was really highly organized, very skillful, and he was able to train slaves into making them a really sort of serious fighting force. He inspired lots of slaves with freedom, with ideas of freedom. And lots of these slaves then were able to kill their masters, take over the island, and even though he was imprisoned, the revolution continued, and eventually the slaves actually managed to declare their island free. It became the first slave-free island in the Caribbean, and so they therefore then renamed it Haiti to show that they are now free. So what I would like you to do, the next task, is he's really a very fascinating character. So I'd like you to do some more research into his life. So focusing on when he was born, when he died, what was his role then? Why is he so important? And really anything interesting or surprising that you can find about him. Some possible websites have been listed here that you could always use. Again, obviously, you're writing this information on the Google Docs here. So if I go back, task 4 is looking at this picture, some more source skills. So this is an artist's coloured picture painting of Toussaint. So I'd like you to think about what impression is the artist trying to give of him. What kind of man does he look like? Think about the objects, think about his sort of structure, what's going on behind him. And then there's a sentence starter here that you can write out and finish this off on the docs slide. So that's really all the work that I want you to complete for this classwork. Please obviously try and write as much as you can. If you're confused or you want more help, then please do email me or write on Google Classroom and I will answer. Like I said, can we make sure that we do this on the Google Docs, and then obviously you need to hand it in. So obviously if you can see the assignment, then you can hand it in like you would do normally for a homework, and that needs to be done by the end of the day. Okay, make sure you're keeping yourself safe. Happy New Year, and I hope this video was useful.